how do you convince a venture capitalist to give you $4 to $5 million for your startup? What are the steps that you take to get to that point?
For the VC, what they're looking for is how do I get a 10x company? And so as an entrepreneur, your job is to actually stop operating for just a little bit and zoom out.
You have gone through the process that I feel like many entrepreneurs would dream of, and that's an acquisition.
It's a deeply emotional experience, and I think founders don't talk about this enough. But for me, it was a huge celebration of we built a great company, one that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars that someone's going to pay us.
If there's any parting words of wisdom that you want to give to our audience, what would it be?
There is no better time, I think, in the history of humanity to be an entrepreneur right now.
Jerry, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Future Work.
Thank you, Amir. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great. So listen, everyone who has that itch to be an entrepreneur obviously wants to start a business, right? What was it for you that made you go, this is a step that I'm going to take. This is something that I'm going to dive into, and I'm going to give it, I would imagine, my absolute all. What was it for you that made you want to be an entrepreneur and take that first step into starting Evisort?
So I started a company called Evisort, which is AI for contracts, one of the first companies in the world to think about using AI for reading contracts. And the reason why I started it was I was solving a personal problem. I was sitting in law school, I was reading contracts, I was getting ready to become a lawyer. And I thought, wow, I don't like a lot of my job, right? It was a very visceral, personal reaction. And so I thought, maybe I can ignore that pain. Maybe I'll just, tough it through.
Sure.
But as I kept learning more about what my role was, the more I realized, I just can't, I don't want to do this. And so for me, that was a very scary moment because you spend your whole life getting ready to do that one role. And then now you're saying, well, I want to change my career. But then I got to thinking, the entrepreneur in me got to thinking, and I thought, if somebody's willing to pay me a couple $100 an hour to do something, and the thing that I'm doing is very manual and it's very repetitive, well, it's a valuable thing that I'm doing. How do I try to build a business in that? And so that was like the aha moment of, hey, I don't like to do this job as a lawyer. Someone's willing to pay me a lot of money for it. Yeah. What if we use AI to try to build a business? And that's how the idea came to be, and it made a lot of sense to me.
Why pivot to AI? What was it about AI that made you go like, this is, you had a problem that you wanted to solve. That's entrepreneurship 101, right? That's how to build a business 101. There's a problem that you're trying to solve. You find the solution to that problem. But what was it that made you go, I'm going to solve this problem through AI? What was it that made you go in that direction?
It wasn't initially, hey, there's a problem, I want to use AI. It was, there's a problem and I want to fix it. And when we started doing research from a founding team perspective, we realized that there's a lot of software companies out there already. I, as a lawyer, was using some of these software tools. But what we realized is that these software tools didn't tell you what's actually inside the contract. And it didn't tell you, is it important or is it not important? And to solve the problem at that level of detail, we had to use AI. And this is 2016. So it wasn't, easy back then to use a foundational model. We had to invent some of the technology. So we had a lot of conviction in the problem we're solving and how we wanted to solve it, to the point where the technology didn't even exist. And we had to actually build that technology.
That's incredible. Okay, so I'm very curious to know what the reaction to those first 10 customers were when you presented Evisort and its platform to them. What was their? You said 2016, right? So this is before AI became the hot button topic that it is today. What were people's reactions when you presented this solution to them?
They said, this is amazing. I've been practicing law for 20 years. I've been waiting 20 years for a solution like this, but does it work? And I think there was a giant but, right? Because when it comes to AI, like you need to make sure that it works. And in 2016, it was an even bigger question. And so the way that we got them comfortable with that problem is that we started doing POCs very early in our sales motion. And POCs was proof of concepts, right? We literally give them the technology and say, play with it, right? Test it yourself, right? And we're going to leave. We're going to give it to you. We're going to leave for a week. And then if you don't like it, then don't buy it. And that was a game changer for us because we knew the product was really good. And so if the customer had the pain, we solved the pain in a valuable way, and the technology works, we had a very high conversion rate.
All right, so Jerry, let's set the stage a little bit. You have 5 customers, you have 2 team members, you know that the product is working, you've tested it out, you know it works, the vision that you had is coming to life. How do you convince a venture capitalist to give you $4 to $5 million for your startup? What are the steps that you take to get to that point?
So I think fundraising is a reaction and a result of the good work before you fundraise,
Okay.
right? And so the VCs are now looking to evaluate businesses. I think the average VC takes 10 plus meetings with companies a week. And so for the VC, what they're looking for is how do I get a 10x company, right? If I put
Mm-hmm.
money in today, and if it's 4 million, then maybe it's a 20 to $30 million post money valuation. How do I see that becoming a 300+ million company and maybe really $3 billion? So they're looking for even more than that. And so as an entrepreneur, your job is to actually stop operating for just a little bit and zoom out, right? Don't
Yeah.
As an operator, we're always in the details. How do I get the marketing website right? How do I get the customer happy? But when you're fundraising, you got to zoom out and you got
Mm-hmm.
to say at a 10,000 foot level, how do I communicate my vision and the business opportunity to somebody who absolutely does not care about my problem? And I think that's really hard for entrepreneurs to do. And I think the test that I use is go to your mom. And if your mom doesn't know the problem space, you got to convince her at Thanksgiving that you're going to drop out of school to go do this full
Wow.
time, right? And if you can
Wow.
have that conversation, that's the same kind of thing you're going to have with a VC, right? So that's really hard to do. I see a lot of entrepreneurs go in with these pitch decks that are super technical. Here's how the computer science works. Here's how the AI works. Here's why the data matters. People at the beginning don't really care about that. They just want to
Sure.
know if you're early stage, C stage investor, if I get in, can this entrepreneur, can this person figure out the journey? So you also have to be interviewing for the role of that CEO.
Jerry, that's fantastic. We're going to talk about culture. Culture is a big thing at Workday, right? We talk about the core values. When you think back to the early days at Evisort, what is something that you did from the start that ended up being a key to building a strong and scalable culture?
We try to keep the organization very flat from the start. And I think that really helped scale the organization and remove some layers of politics. So Evisor grew really quickly. We went from 0 to 300 employees in 5 years. And so there was founding, refounding, new management teams, pain that came with that, and then the success that came with that.
Uh-huh.
But from the very beginning, we actually started the company with 7 people. And
Okay.
so it wasn't just, one person went out, raised money, and then started a company. I
Mhm.
started the company from the very beginning very flat. And so these 7 people, as the company got bigger, all went off to be leaders in different parts of the organization.
Right.
But they brought that founder DNA with them, right? So one went to marketing, one into sales, two into product. And so they brought that founding ethos and that entrepreneurial spirit into these other organizations. And that was so important for us culturally.
Absolutely. And was that easy for you to maintain that culture as the company grew? You said you went from 0 to 300 in 5 years. As the company was growing and escalated the way that it did you find it was easier to maintain that culture or was it harder to maintain that culture? And did you have to make adjustments to that culture as the company grew?
It was very difficult to maintain the
Mhm.
culture because we also raised a lot of money. And so
Sure.
when you're growing really quickly, you're getting big customer logos, there's venture money coming in, and you're
Mhm.
winning every award that Silicon Valley likes to give out. It attracts a different kind of character,
Sure.
not worse, but just different than the kind of people that start a company. And
Mhm.
so for us, we were very careful as we're interviewing to not bring in people who are just profit motivated.
I see.
We were very careful when we were interviewing to bring in people that wanted to be in for the long haul of the journey.
Yep.
And so we would interview way more than other companies. I have friends who run entrepreneurial ventures where they hire very, very quickly after a fundraising round. I
Mhm.
told my board, no, we're not going to drop the talent bar just to go fast. We want to get the right people in, and that may take us an extra month to fill a role, but that's what we're going to do.
I love that. I absolutely love that because maintaining that culture is super important to the growth of the company overall. And talking about growing the company, let's talk about some growing pains. Every startup has growing pains. They hit rough patches as it scales. Was there a moment at Evisort that really tested you? And if so, what did you learn from that that might help other leaders who might be watching this podcast navigate that phase that they're in at the moment?
So this is a story that entrepreneurs of my vintage will resonate with.
Yeah.
We raised a big funding round, and then COVID happened. And so we went from a very tight knit culture of in the office, 6 days a week, that kind of a thing, to working on Zoom, right? And employees that were now moving out of state. And so it completely disrupted our operating model. And it
100%.
was very difficult, right? Because you go from an in-person environment where it's, we're eating dinner together most nights, early stage entrepreneurship, to working remotely. Well, that's when you have to get really good at setting clear North Stars,
Right.
clear operating metrics, and then measuring for accountability. Because that's when somebody could be, at home, watching Netflix for half the day, right? So
Sure.
that was a big disruption. And I remember being with a group of CEOs when COVID was happening, and we're all going remote. And a lot of us were very, very worried. Some of us thought this was existential to the operations of our business. And what we actually found is that by setting the right culture and the right values, we actually kept going with our business and we actually accelerated our growth. And that's something I'm incredibly proud of.
That's incredible. In regards to team building, how did your approach to building and empowering teams shift as Evisort grew? And now that you're a Workday, what's one of the principles about team building that still holds true for you?
I think employees and folks that are a part of a team, I generally believe they like to do good work, but sometimes they can get misaligned. So they need leadership to set a very clear goal that's measurable. And then at that point, they have to get aligned to that goal. And then for leadership, we have to rally them, right? And that's something I'm doing at Workday. It's something I did at Evisort. But I think it's so important as a leader to say, yes, there's many priorities, but for the next 12 months, this is the one that matters, and here's why. Here's how we got to that decision. And then I need you to do X, Y, and Z. And then as we did monthly all hands, as we did meetings, I would always kick off the meeting by reminding the company, here is that goal we talked about at the beginning of the year. Here's how we're progressing against that goal. And then call out areas where we need to make improvements and say, let's go and take the hill head on. Right? That's the way that I led. I'm more of a wartime general than I am a peacetime general. But I found that by creating that momentum in the company, it actually solved a lot of cultural issues.
Let's talk about sustainability. It's sustaining a business. Most small businesses don't make it past the first year, right? 20% of small businesses fail in their first year. Almost 50% fail in the first 5 years. Whopping 65% fail in the first 10 years. What was it, if you could pinpoint one thing that you felt that Evisort did really well, and you said you grew rapidly, right? What was it that you think attributed to that, right? Was it leadership? Was it the product? Was it the employees? Was it the culture? Was it a combination of things? What was it that helped you get past that first year bump of survival and then initially, each milestone after that?
I think it's two things. The first is employee. And I love this phrase, talent density. Right? Talent density is just so important because you could easily hire 10 people and 5 are not great.
Sure.
And then you're 50% down from the average. Right? But if you hire 10 people who are all really good and they're holding each other accountable with their work ethic, with their work product, with their intensity and their values, and you build a culture that uplifts itself and then starts to become a standard that self-enforces. So the first part is getting a really good team together. The second part is focusing on customer. I think if you focus on the customer, a few things happen. One, your product is focused around the customer. And then your sales team is focused around the customer. And then the way you service the customer and the marketing and everything just kind of aligns to the core values of being aligned to the customer. So if you have a really good team and you're maniacally focused on the customer, I think the company starts to run itself in some ways. But it's so easy for one of these two things to become disjointed. And that's where you see a lot of problems.
In talking about the longevity of a small business and, the metrics of how long small businesses usually survive, given the amount of time that they have been in business, what is a piece of advice that you would give to someone, an elevator pitch almost? If someone ran into you in an elevator and was like, hey, I just started my small business. I'm really hoping that this thing grows. What is one piece of advice that you would give me to maintain the longevity of this business that I just started?
I would say for the first couple of years, do non-scalable things.
Okay.
And that's very contradictory to how do you scale, how do you get big. But in the first couple of years, you're just trying to survive. You don't
Right.
have to solve the problem elegantly that lasts as a solution for 10 years. I'll give you an example. For us in the beginning, how do we get our first 10 customers? I just hustled. I
Mm,
just myself went out and got the customers. I called them, I
mm,
visited them, I did the pitch myself. I
mm.
didn't build a big marketing engine or a sales engine because I couldn't afford to, honestly.
Sure.
And I didn't need to, right? I just needed to get over the hump and get revenue in the door. And then once you do that, then you can think about how to do the next act. I see a lot of entrepreneurs in the very beginning try to build very scalable solutions, spend a lot of time planning, a lot of time spending money, and then not actually moving the needle. So my number one advice for the first couple of years is do non-scalable things and just punch through glass. Just run through the wall. And then if you get to where you need to go in the first couple of years, then you can think about the future afterwards.
We are on the Future Work podcast, right? So let's talk about the future of work. What's one lesson from building Evisort that you think will matter even more as the future of work continues to shift, right? We're in this world right now where literally, quite literally, every day there is something new that gets added to how we work, right? And what that future of work looks like.
It's pretty clear now that agents are going to be part of the workforce. It's pretty clear. It's just like software and SaaS has been for the last 15 years, right? So agents is the next version of that. And so what I'm doing right now at Workday is I'm helping build agents. And it's a really interesting piece of work because Workday is so successful as a software business. But as we think about agents, it's almost a new rethinking of how we deliver value to customers. And so it's not just the work is changing for our customers, even the way that we think about how to do work overall as the people building the agents, we're thinking first principles. And I think it's similar to what I did at Evisort, right? I was a lawyer, I was sitting there, I was using software, and I said, wow, this is good, but it's not great. Right. So how do we actually get closer to getting rid of the parts of people's jobs that they don't like to do? Right. So they can spend more time doing what they do like to do. And so at Workday, when I think about the opportunity for agents, I think about let's just take auditing as an example. Right. And an audit is such an expensive thing, it's a painful thing to react to for most organizations. How do we take that and flip it on its head? How do we put AI through that entire process where the humans are having to do the strategic work? They're doing the thinking around it, but they're not going out gathering the documents to respond to the audit request. Nobody wants to do that. So that's going to completely change how work gets done in that space. And I think as a society, we're just getting started. I think in 5 years, some of the things that we used to do today that's manual, the next generation is going to say, well, I can't believe you did that.
When you talk to folks about agents and you get that trepidation about it, about I don't want to say fear, but just that almost puzzled look of like, is this really a thing and is this really going to happen? Is it really going to do what everyone says is it going to do? What's your reaction to that? Because you are saying that we are moving into a world of agents, right? And that is absolutely the future of work. How do you explain that to someone of like this is what agents are and this is how they're going to make such a drastic shift in the way we work?
I think there's two parts. One is
Mm,
simplify. An agent does a
mm,
part of somebody's job, and usually it's the manual, tedious parts. So forget
right.
the technology. If I don't like driving, autopilot would do most of the steering for me now. Right? That's
Sure.
interesting. Right? That's interesting.
Right.
My mom can understand that. Right? And she hates driving.
Hmm.
So that's simplify it. And
There you
then the
go.
second part of it is show them. Right? I think that's the big thing. Is I remember when Steve Jobs will be launching a new product, and I just saw a video
Mm,
recently where he was launching FaceTime on the iPhone 4. Instead of
okay.
explaining all the bits and bytes, he gets on stage and he FaceTimes an employee of his. And the
Sure.
entire stadium erupts into claps. You might remember that, right? So
I
it
do.
was
Yeah.
that was him being a marketing genius saying it's a
Hmm.
deeply technical concept, but I'm just going to show it to you and then let you react to that. And I think agents has the same capabilities.
I love that. I think that's an incredible way to show people what agents are and how they would work. You have gone through the process that I feel like many entrepreneurs would dream of, and that's an acquisition, right? Being acquired by a company like Workday. Tell me about that experience. What was your initial reaction to getting that call of Workday's interest in Evisort, and how did that play out for you? And to piggyback off of that, how does your day to day now look versus what your day to day looked like before?
It's a deeply emotional experience. And I
Hmm.
think founders don't talk about this enough. But for me, it was a huge celebration of we built a great company, one that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars that someone's
Mm-hmm.
going to pay us. So
Yeah.
on one side, it's like, this is dream come true. On the
Sure.
other side, it was a little sad, right? Because we
Mm.
were nervous that, hey, we loved what we were doing.
Right.
And is that going to change, right? And, we created our dream job. We literally went out and created the job we wanted. And so if we don't have that job, how does that impact us and our employees? Luckily, Workday is a great company. And so all of our employees came over. We kept doing our jobs. And in fact, we actually got more investment so we can actually go faster. And so
Right.
I'm so grateful to Workday for the way they do M&As. And I contrast that with some of my other friends' companies where they get acquired and the founder leaves in 6 months, right? And that's,
Mhm.
that's a classic form of doing M&A. And I just think that that's not what I was looking for. I loved what I was doing. I wanted to keep building it. I just wanted to do it bigger. I wanted to do it internationally. I wanted to do it with larger clients. I wanted to do it in more different segments. And with Workday, we've been able to realize that, plus many more.
Earlier you talked about you hustled a lot, right? You personally went to those 10 customers and got them to be the first customers for Evisort. When did you realize that your hustle mindset needed to evolve into a more sustainable and strategic approach? And what prompted that shift? When did you realize that you needed to be a little bit more strategic about that mindset?
It was when I had a first couple set of customers and my time was becoming stretched. I was
Mm,
focusing on getting new meetings, pitching new customers, servicing the existing customers, making sure they're happy, having to run the product organization, having to run the engineering organization, having to fundraise, then having to make sure that our employees are happy. Wow, this is the CEO job is hard. And so when
yeah.
I felt really stretched like that was when I realized, hey, we have to start thinking about building the next layer. And
Hmm.
very, very lucky for me, I actually had law school classmates that were with me in the very beginning. So they were already following along in this
Nice.
journey. And
Yes.
they naturally scaled to become the leaders of departments. And I'm so lucky for that because if it was just up to me, we would have failed, right? But because I had friends and co-founders that were with me who were tremendous leaders in their own right, I was able to delegate a little bit and have that trust where maybe they're not going to do it exactly the way that I do it, but that's
Yeah.
okay. They're great. Let them run.
I would imagine that you didn't go to school for entrepreneurship, right? You became a lawyer, right? And from there, you found a problem that was, let's say, for lack of a better term, the bane of your existence, and you wanted to address that and start a company. What does that mind shift look like when you're going from I am a law student and a lawyer to I'm a business owner? Because to me, those are two completely different things.
I think the shift from being, I'll just say, an employee doing a
Hmm.
profession to being a owner operator is a
Right.
huge shift. It's
Yeah.
really something you can't learn in a textbook. And I
Right.
think when you run your own P&L, even if it's $1 in and $1 out, your
Mm,
brain goes into a different place, right? You start
mm,
thinking about the totality of facts. You start thinking about short term versus long term. You start thinking about risk and where do you invest and where do you put bets. And for me, that's really when your life activates, is when you're in that role and now you're thinking about the totality of facts. And I think
mm.
for me, I encourage everyone to take on entrepreneurial endeavors. It doesn't mean start your own company. You can join and advise companies. You can be an
Sure.
investor. You can join
Yes.
nonprofits, but you have to think about the totality of facts. And I think for folks who haven't experienced that, it is a great awakening of the mind and of the
Mhm.
intellect, but also of the heart. You care so deeply about what you're
Yeah.
building. And that's why people say an entrepreneur thinks about their company as their baby. It really
Mm,
is. It is something that was an idea in my head and my co-founders' heads. And we manifested a reality with
yeah.
people, with product, with funding, with customers. It really is the great honor of our lives.
Do you think that's why people romanticize the idea of being an entrepreneur, of having their own business? Obviously, there is the allure of being in charge of your own time and kind of dictating your own things and not having to answer to anyone and those sorts of things. But do you think that also plays into the overall desire to start a business, to go after it, to follow that dream, to create something out of nothing and to see it succeed?
I believe everyone wants to have purpose in life.
Mm,
It just looks in different forms.
hmm.
And I think for the people who want to take the hill and they want to do their best work, being a owner is the way to do that, or being a part of that ownership team. And so for the first 20 employees, I literally hand delivered their equity package. And I said, I'm not your CEO. I'm not your manager. You are a owner also.
Love
So
that.
in the 5 o'clock at night when it's easy to go to happy hour, but there's one
Sure.
more thing that you need to get done, think about this as your house, right? If you had a piece of trash on your floor at home, you would pick it up. Think about this company as yours. And I think when you have that culture and that mentality, you
Mhm.
encourage people to be their best. And then you don't have some of the politics and the backstabbing. Because I used to say when there's friction, of course there's going to be friction. We all own the same equity. So
Yeah.
let's go.
I absolutely love that. That is a fantastic mentality to have. And I agree 1000%. What are the personal qualities that you think are absolutely essential for a small business owner to succeed and stay motivated, especially during challenging times?
I think it's three things. You have to be tenacious.
Mhm.
You have to be a problem solver. And I think you have to be good with relationships.
Yeah.
I'll take those one by one. The reason why you have to be tenacious is that you're not going to just be lucky every time. Even if you got lucky and you got to 0 to 100 million, you're going to have a problem at 100 million that you've never seen before. And
Mhm.
so you got to always be tenacious. That leads to my second point, which is you have to be a problem solver. I think being an entrepreneur is actually a very challenging task because you're solving problems that by definition you've never seen before. I
Mhm.
went from being the HR person to the sales person to the product person to the customer success person. I've never done most of those jobs. And so for the first time, I'm thinking about a problem and I have to do it well at the very onset. And so you have to be a tenacious problem solver, but then relationship comes in.
Yes.
Relationship comes in because how you treat people matters. Your customers, your investors, your employees. When you have a good relationship and it bumps in the night, people
Mhm.
give you more grace because they know that as a human being, you're doing your best. And I think
Right.
that for me was one of the great gifts that I have great relationships with all of my stakeholders. And so when there was difficulty, I was able to rely on those relationships, go to dinner, get in person, talk through how I'm trying to solve the problem. And people usually give me the benefit of the doubt.
I love that. That is incredible insight, Jerry. Thank you. One bonus question before I let you go. Your top productivity hack.
My best productivity hat is
Mhm.
actually delegation.
Okay.
And my wife doesn't like this because sometimes I delegate to her and she says, I'm not an employee. But that's actually, it's a skill, right?
Yeah.
And I think delegation is really hard for a lot of people because you have to be okay with a degree of uncertainty, right? If I
Sure.
did it myself, I would do it this way. But if I delegate, then, there's a variance factor.
Mm.
I think being good at delegating is also going to be really important for the future of work because you also have to delegate work to agents, right? And it's
Yes.
the same kind of mindset. But for me to go from leading a small company to one with 20 people to one with 50 to 100 to 300 and now leading a broader organization at Workday, I can't do it all myself, right? Being able to delegate and being able to trust is a really, really critical thing for productivity.
I love that. I think that's a great way to end things. Jerry, thank you so much for your time and joining us on the Future Work podcast. Congratulations again on the acquisition of Evisort into Workday. Welcome to the Workday family. If there's any parting words of wisdom that you want to give to our audience, what would it be?
There is no better time, I think, in the history of humanity to be an entrepreneur right now. There
Mm.
is no better time. I teach innovation and entrepreneurship at Harvard University, and I just finished my course a few weeks ago. And I was able to get together with the young people, the students that are going to be the future leaders. And I got to say, I was impressed. This is my fourth year teaching the same course, and every year the students are getting more creative. The young people are getting more creative, and I
Mhm.
think it's because AI allows them to actually learn way more information than in the past, and then AI allows them to actually build early versions of their products without needing to incur too much cost. And so right now you have this great level of information and a great productivity tool, which is AI. If you combine those two things, it's a great time to be an entrepreneur. So it's just really, really exciting.
Amazing words to end on. Thank you again so much, Jerry.
Cool. Thank you, Amir.